First of all, thanks for being able to speak with me and everything about the book. The place is who we are, which very enjoyable. Just curious, how did you come about starting on the book? What led to it?
Thanks, Craig. It's great to be here. I've had the good fortune to work with Indigenous peoples around the world in Canada and in New Zealand. That's a Kiwi accent that people can hear for now going on close to 30 years. And in the course of that work, just learning about individuals, about communities, about systems of Indigenous relationships and governance and care for land and resource management. I thought there are some stories to tell here. And about 5 years ago, I was in a place where it was just made a lot of sense, where that all came together to produce a book that amplifies the voices of some of those Indigenous peoples, because I could have written about thousands of people doing amazing work, but identifying just some of the, especially the younger leaders in this field who are working in their communities to tell their stories about who they are as individuals, Indigenous people in the places that their ancestors are from and have been from for thousands and thousands of years, and to talk about that connection to place and what that means in terms of the work that they do in their communities, their relationship to their lands and waters, and resource management in a way that is very rich, that can tell stories that are meaningful to all of us, actually, as Canadians, to understand our own connection
Hmm.
to the places that we're from and how we relate to them and how we, um, use them and care for them. And I thought there's never been a better time in this era of climate change and becoming clearer and clearer that the way we use resources are not very efficient or very effective, in fact, pretty destructive. To just share some of these fantastic stories, and happily all the people I contacted to work with and ask if they would be willing to do so thought that was a great idea.
And then you have the 10 stories. How did you choose? How did you know kind of what stories you wanted to use for this?
I wanted to have readers understand that there's just this huge diversity of places and of people and of the kind of initiatives that are taking place to restore well-being and to showcase, in particular, the overall theme of the book, which is that fundamental interconnection of people with place and with well-being. If the place that you live in and care for is healthy, then it will take care of you and you will be healthy. So I already knew some of the people who are in the book, some of the 10 stories, and then through other connections, was introduced to a range of some of the other people. A number of these, all of these communities are doing work in different ways because they're quite different places. So, for example, I have Chief Christopher Roberts from Waiwaikum Nation in Campbell River, which is quite an urban, industrialized area of Vancouver Island, talking about how you care for place, how you apply ancestral ways of being and ancestral law in a place that is so industrialized for the well-being of your people and what the challenges are. Then, by comparison to that, in Haida Gwaii, what used to be known as the Queen Charlotte Islands, we have Haida people who are working with their youth and their children in rediscovery camps that have been running for more than 40 years now, reconnecting their children to their ancestral places and how they relate to those in their stories. And the evidence after 40 years of how kids do so much better when they're connected to who they are and their identity that way is very compelling. You have places like Bella Coola and the New Hope people, very remote, very hard to get to, very spiritual story that Clyde Talio, a young Indigenous leader in his community, speaks to. So I wanted to show that diversity, that there is no one size fits all, which can be something that we in a non-Indigenous world mistakenly think about Indigenous people. And this very clearly demonstrates that there are common themes around making sure everybody does their best to take care of these lands and waters that support us, but they all do it in very different ways.
The idea of environmental stewardship feels like it's a new thing, the past few decades, but with the Indigenous, that's something that goes back long before Europeans ever arrived in Canada. Why do you feel this is kind of the right time to be showing that, to show that the environmental stewardship is not a new thing, but it is something we need to start thinking about and dealing with?
Thank you for raising that. I think for me, that was one of the most compelling things that I learned, because in the 4 years that it took to produce this book during COVID, what's more,
Mhm.
um, I learned, continued to learn as I do today, continued to learn just amazing things about these Indigenous approaches to environmental stewardship. And one of the really compelling things that came out for me was the fact that we need to turn our minds to pre-colonial systems of environmental stewardship, and we need to do it urgently, because look at the state the world is in. And it came, I mean, my light bulb moment on that was when Jessie Hemphill, who is from Gwasalnakura First Nations, and she spoke to that in the Sacred Connection, chapter 2 in the book. She said, when you speak to Indigenous people about how to manage the future for our children and our grandchildren, great grandchildren, you can't actually set a pathway for the future until you clear the table of the past. And so all the stories talk about the impact of colonization. Now, to understand those impacts, because I think people who are paying attention have some understanding of the impacts of things like the residential school system and everything to do with colonization having negative impacts on Indigenous peoples, the way colonization was implemented. But what we, and I certainly didn't necessarily, or hadn't turned my mind to before doing the book, was to understand the scope of that impact, you have to actually understand how things were before, and how brilliant and sophisticated these systems of governance, of resource management, of law, of relationships with each other were, going back 14,000 years. I mean, that's 700 generations of people who not only survived in the places that they were in, but thrived in those. That's older than any other civilization I know of on Earth. So they must have been doing something pretty well to
Yeah,
achieve that. So if you think about that in those terms, there's a lot we can learn from those systems of relationship. And the single most important thing is that everybody told me is the place you're from, the land you're on, the waters that you work with tell you how to manage them. You don't tell them how you're going to manage them, which makes so much sense when you think about it. And that's why those relationships, not only with the lands and waters, are so healthy, but relationships with each other, because you can't do what the land is telling you in your place unless the person in the next valley or across on the next island is doing things in a similar way. So you have to have those strong relationships as well. And that's a system I think we could all benefit from learning more about.
absolutely. And now the book features many photographs. How did you go about that? And was it especially challenging with COVID to be able to round those up? Because you can't travel, or just be difficult finding people to get photos from and things like that.
Absolutely, yes. The photography was all done remotely because, as I say, I did this entire book during COVID. I need to write a book about writing a book in COVID like this.
Yeah, no doubt.
In a way, the silver lining to that was that people were much more available and wanting. There was time to talk. People were stuck at home in their living rooms, and to be able to connect to another human by Zoom and talk about these incredibly important things, in some ways, made it a bit easier for me. Now, the photography, I was very, very fortunate because there was already a large inventory of some photographs. I want to give a shout out to a fellow named Brody Guy, who was the chief executive of an organization called Coast Funds, Indigenous-led conservation and sustainable economic development organization, that has actually helped really support me for the work on this book. And Brody has supplied more than 100 photographs that we could use. They're fantastic photographs. So there was that. There were a number of people who donated photographs. Of course, I asked everybody, do you have fabulous photographs of yourself that I could use? And I've acknowledged all of the photographers in the book who were happy to do that. And then where there were gaps, I just did what you do. You go online and you look for really great photos. And if there were photos already in existence, I purchased licenses to use them. If I needed to get a photographer to get new photographs, I arranged to do that to pay for new photography. The key thing was to ensure that the people in the book were happy with the photographs that I used, because I do want to emphasize that, as a non-Indigenous person writing about Indigenous people, well, anybody else's story, it's incredibly important to me and always has been to make sure that everything is fully permission-based. Everybody is very comfortable with what I've written. So I did that with all of the writing, and I did that with all of the photographs as well, to make sure that this book comes out, everybody is going to be celebrating their stories being told this way and their photographs being part of those stories.
In regards to the environmental stewardship, do you feel like focusing on the north central coastal part of BC, an area that's so very unique? You have a rainforest; it's extremely beautiful. Helps push that message of preserving areas such as that and that are so unique within Canada.
I would hope so. I mean, the Great Bear Rainforest and Great Bear Sea, it's a region that I'm fortunate enough to be very familiar with, because I've worked in that area and traveled in that area for decades now. But and it is unique and it is incredibly special. And I certainly hope people see that in the photography and they see that in the stories about the need to care for these special places. And at the same time, though, there are special places all over the planet, and they're special to other communities and other cultures in different ways, of course. And I think it's a very relatable place in that context. I'm currently actually speaking to me in New Zealand at the moment, where I'm doing some work here with Indigenous peoples, and there are incredibly special places here. And these themes resonate there. I've worked in Costa Rica, and these themes resonate in those beautiful, beautiful cloud forests and coastal environments in Costa Rica, all over the world. We can look at methods of taking care of these places. And Craig, you used the word preserve, and that's an interesting word to use, because that's a theme, I think, that we wanted to talk about very much in this book, about
Mhm.
what does conservation mean? What does protection mean? What does preservation mean? And in the context of this Indigenous approach, it actually centers human beings as part of the place, not separate from the place. And I think in our non-Indigenous world, my experience has been that we tend to put aside certain pieces of land and say we are going to preserve that. There is no role for humanity in that other than putting a fence around it and saying nobody can touch it. But then we allow everywhere else to be utilized for resource extraction in a way that isn't sustainable. And then we look at the well-being of people and we go, well, people are sick, we put in band-aid legislation or measures to try and address well-being, and we don't see that actually everywhere should be protected, with the sense of people being part of that protection. We need to extract resources. Of course we do. We need
Mhm.
stuff. We need to eat. We need houses. We need things to help us get from place to place. But we need to do it more sustainably. And if we center ourselves as humans within that context of environmental stewardship, protection, conservation, preservation, whatever you want to call it, we'll just do a better job of that. We will protect these special places. We will be able to use the resources wisely and well. None of us need to be short of the resources that we need, but we will put the environment and landscape that we're part of in a much healthier place, so as to ensure that 7 generations from now, 700 generations from now,
Mhm.
they'll be able to enjoy these places the same way.
You touched on it a little bit, but what do you hope people get out of seeing this book and seeing the pictures and hearing the stories?
I would hope that people, if I place myself as a non-Indigenous person, particularly reading this book and seeing these stories, relating to it, understanding a bit better, um, these stories, these people, because I'm so grateful to the people who told their stories. They told very personal stories about their lives and what it means to them to be doing the work they're doing and what environmental stewardship and human well-being mean to them. It's very relatable that people can just understand and empathize better with that very important connection to land and place. When you hear Indigenous people saying land back, there's a very understandable connection to that. So I hope that's understood a bit better. I hope that people, wherever they live in Canada, wherever they live in the world, would read these stories and look at their own places and think about how they relate to it and the people that they have relationships with in this place and how they can make lives better for themselves and others. And I certainly hope for Indigenous people who read this book that they get a very well-deserved sense of pride in the way Indigenous peoples around the world and Indigenous peoples in the Great Barrier Rainforest have approached their stewardship and their relationships with each other and their relationships with non-Indigenous people, because they're so generous and gracious towards the settlers who have come into these lands and waters, and especially the young people most of all, that they see hope. There really is such a sense of hope and vision for the future for the kids that will be able to do really well out of this and be incredibly proud of who they are and be healthy, happy people as a result.
And obviously, in Canada right now, truth and reconciliation is a very big thing and something we're moving towards. Books like this, do you feel like that helps as well, kind of sharing a message of, the Indigenous, their land, their stewardship of the land, and that kind of thing?
Well, I hope so. There's very different interpretations of what reconciliation means for a start. Truth, absolutely. I think anybody who reads the Gwasalanachurach story, um, who doesn't know it already, will be, I hope, absolutely shocked and appalled at what has happened to Indigenous peoples. It's one of the most egregious examples of how government treated First Nations people here. Um, Reconciliation, as I say, has different meanings for people. I think part of the key to reconciliation, if we think about it in terms of um, well-being, because that is one of my main themes in this book, is to talk about human well-being as well as environmental well-being, then it requires us to not just apologize for the past, but really, as to use Jesse's expression again, to clear the table of the past, we have to listen. We really have to understand. We have to not push back on that. And we have to understand that to set the pathway for the future, we as settlers or colonizers cannot impose that on Indigenous peoples. They are the ones who will determine that future.
Hmm.
And so, what I hope out of this book, it will contribute to that conversation in a good and meaningful way, where, in particular, anybody who doesn't understand that or may be a little fearful of what that is or what that might mean can feel comfortable that there's nothing to fear in a future where Indigenous peoples are taking care of our lands and waters in Canada and doing so in a really good way, and therefore benefiting all of us as Canadians.